It's been a year since the Trump administration exited from the Iran nuclear deal and mounted what the president dubbed a maximum pressure campaign. Since then, talk of possible war between the two countries has continued to mount. I spoke with Professor Vincent Ferraro of Mount Holyoke College about the state of foreign policy between our country and Iran, and I first asked him the last time that relations were this tense.
Oh, you'd have to go back to 1979, 1980 to get as bad a situation as we have right now, although there have been plenty of bad episodes in between, but this is really quite extreme.
And when you look at that would have been Carter-Reagan administration era response to Iran at that time, what was the end result then?
Well, the end result was that Carter invaded Iran trying to rescue the hostages. It ended up with a humiliation. And then mysteriously, Iran released all the hostages on the day that Reagan was inaugurated, which suggests that there was some sort of back channel.
Let's jump ahead to 2019 and current relations between the United States and Iran. We've seen the Trump administration move reinforcements to the region. We've seen the Trump administration reportedly move personnel out of Iraq. What message do you think that this is sending to Iranian leaders?
Well, I think the most important message was sending the aircraft carrier group Abraham Lincoln into the Persian Gulf, because that's really the fundamental source of American power in the region. It's not troops on the ground in Iraq. They're hostage, actually, to both Iraq and to Iran. So I'm not sure what the small movement of troops really signals, except Trump's willingness to engage. But I'm not sure that Iran takes that seriously.
Well, I was just going to say, so is that a clear message that war is where we are at, or is it something more subtle than that?
Oh, it's much more subtle than that, because the number of troops that have been sent in are not nearly enough to do anything substantive. So we just have to wait to see what they do subsequently, particularly with the movement of the naval forces.
President Trump has said several times that he's not looking for regime change in Iran. But in your opinion, what would the United States stand to gain if regime change, tough word for me today, was to take place?
Well, that would depend on who replaced the regime. I mean, right now, I think the hardliners in Iran are in control. So if Rouhani were to somehow be upended, I think it would be a worse government for the United States that would take power. The moderate forces in Iran really aren't well organized right now, but the hardliners are. So regime change is really a silly objective for the United States in this particular context.
Interesting time for you and I to be having this conversation just on sort of anniversaries. From an anniversaries perspective, you have National Security Advisor Bolton just over a year in his position, just beyond a year of the Trump administration in the United States coming out of the Iran nuclear deal. And then this maximum pressure campaign was mounted. What did you expect when you saw these two things happen, John Bolton coming in and Iran nuclear deal being removed, or the U.S. removing itself from it? What did you think then?
Well, as soon as Bolton was installed as National Security Advisor, we knew that something big was going to happen with respect to Iran. Bolton has been in favor of regime change in Iran for a very long time, and as well as Secretary of State Pompeo. So that's the objective of the underlings in the Trump administration. What we don't know is what Trump's objectives are. And I think the more critical variable here, other than the passing of the anniversaries, was the re-election of Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, because that more or less solidified the situation between the United States and Israel on the issue of Iran, as well as the United States' desire to satisfy Saudi Arabia, which views Iran as an enemy.
Where does Europe sit in all of this? I mean, recently we've read reports of Iran applying pressure to Europe, saying, look, economic times are tough here in Iran. It's time for you to step up and help.
Well, I think the Iranians have a very good case, because the Iran nuclear deal promised the relief of sanctions against Iran as long as they adhered to the deal. And all the evidence was that they did adhere to the deal. And so they feel betrayed. When the U.S. pulled out of the Iranian agreement, the Europeans promised Iran that they would have a different way to have trade with Iran. That hasn't worked out well. And so the Iranians, on the anniversary of the U.S. departure from the deal, said, okay, we're going to give Europe 60 days, which is still counting right now, to try to work out an arrangement for renewed trade. And if that doesn't happen, then all bets are off. So the Europeans are in a really tough situation. They don't agree with American policy at all. They're fundamentally opposed to it. But European corporations realize that the American market is much more desirable than the Iranian market. And therefore, the companies of Europe really have no choice but to obey the sanctions. So we'll see what happens.
I was just going to say, and so then where does that leave the situation?
Well, there are a number of buyers of Iranian oil, such as China and India, Pakistan, who are going to flout the sanctions. And it really depends upon how much oil they'll consume and the extent to which they can get Iranian oil on tankers and to consume it. I suspect that most of the world wants to see that Iranian oil flow. And therefore, there are going to be all sorts of willing participants in evading the sanctions. But the U.S. can be very persistent, and the payment system is really the key. So we'll see how that works out.
We talked at the beginning of our discussion a bit about historical context. I'd like to have us look at more recent historical context. Let's go back to Republican administrations under President Bush, 41 and 43. What comparisons can we make between their approach to Iran and the current Republican administrations?
Well, previous Republican administrations were always hostile to Iran, and in that respect, Trump is not different at all. The key difference was the nuclear deal, and the fear of Iran becoming a nuclear power is genuine. They certainly have the capability to do so. So all stops were pulled in order to prevent that from happening. So the Trump administration, by pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, have upped the stakes considerably. And now Iran is calling the U.S. bluff by saying, okay, you want to pull out, that's fine. If Europe doesn't honor its agreements, then we're going to enrich uranium, we're going to enrich our capabilities. They still haven't announced that they're going to become a nuclear power, but they're really putting the screws to the world, and we'll see.
In addition to nuclear tensions, you have this question of war being discussed very frequently, and some comparisons being made between potential war with Iran and previous 2003 war engagements in Iraq. Is that a fair comparison?
Well, it's a misleading comparison. Okay, Iraq is a much smaller country than Iran, much less diversified than Iran is. Iran has significantly greater capabilities than Iraq ever did. The idea of overthrowing or invading Iran is ludicrous. I mean, it really is a ridiculous proposition. When Trump said that would be the end of Iran, I have no idea what he really meant. The United States is not in a position to invade Iran. It doesn't have the troops to do it. It doesn't have the logistical support to do it. It doesn't have the support of its allies to do it, except for Israel and Saudi Arabia. And so the only real question is, can we take out their nuclear facilities with an aerial bombardment? And I suspect that the answer to that is, well, you could probably damage them for a short period of time, but within a year they'd have everything back in operation. So the use of force against Iran is, I think, a non-starter. It's really not going to accomplish anything.
A moment ago, you said you didn't know what President Trump was thinking, and there has been also reporting that there's some lack of clarity between what John Bolton is thinking and his agenda and what President Trump is thinking and his agenda. What's your take on that?
I think that split is genuine. I think that there is no policy of the Trump administration. I think it's incoherent, and that a lot of it is made up on the fly. And a lot of it is rhetorical and in tweets, but there's nothing remotely like a systematic, sustained policy in place.